Hello friends, today I will be reading I Survived the Great Chicago Fire, 1871 by Lauren Tarshish. Chapter 1, Sunday, October 8th, 1871, 11:30 p.m., Chicago. The fire started inside a barn. It was tiny at first, a glowing dot, some wisps of white smoke, then flames reached up. They grabbed hold of a pile of hay, crackle, pop, and then boom! Towers of flame shot up higher, punching through the roof, reaching for the sky. Voices screamed out, "Fire, fire, fire!" Alarm bells clanged. Firefighters readied their horses and raced their pumpers through the streets, but it was too late. The flames blasted a shower of fiery sparks into the windy sky like a swarm of flaming wasps. They flew through the air, starting fires wherever they landed. Shops and homes erupted in flames, warehouses exploded, mansions burned. Crowds of panicked people fled their houses and rushed through the streets, and along the wooden sidewalks they screamed and pushed and knocked one another down, desperate to get away from the choking smoke and broiling flames, but there was no escape. The winds blew harder, flames shot hundreds of feet in the air, spreading across miles and miles, and in the middle of it all was an 11-year-old, Oscar Starling. Oscar had never felt so terrified, not even 2 years ago, when a killer blizzard hit his family's Minnesota farm. He was trapped inside a burning house, fighting for his life. He'd made it down the stairs, desperate to escape, and then crash! A ball of fire and cinders crashed through the window, and the house exploded in flames. And suddenly, Oscar was in the fire's ferocious grip. The flames clawed at him, seared him, threw him to the ground. Smoke gushed up his nose and into his mouth. But the worst was the blistering heat, the feeling of being roasted alive. Was this the end? Oscar had never wanted to come to this city, and now he was sure he was going to die here. Chapter 2, 3 hours earlier, a train to Chicago. Don't puke. That's what Oscar had been telling himself for the past 9 hours as the train chugged and swayed and jerked its way toward Chicago. They crossed 400 miles of wide-open prairie. For hours, Oscar had been staring out the window. There had been nothing to see but shoulder-high grass and a few scrawny buffalo that seemed to wave goodbye to Oscar with their swishing tails. Now that they were getting closer to the city, Oscar couldn't bear to look. He slouched down in his seat and glued his eyes to his dusty boots. "Are you feeling all right, Oscar?" Mr. Morrow said. "I'm fine, sir," Oscar lied. "Such a long trip," Mama said, her freckled face shining with excitement. "I feel like we're heading up to the moon." Mama and Mr. Morrow both laughed, but nothing seemed funny to Oscar. So much had happened these past few weeks. He was in a state of shock. Mama had married Mr. Morrow. They had sold the Minnesota farm where Oscar had lived his entire life, and now they were moving to a strange city that might as well be the moon. No wonder Oscar felt sick. Of course, the real nightmare had happened 2 years ago when Papa died. He was killed in a vicious blizzard, a wall of ice and snow and wind that slammed into their prairie town with no warning. Papa had been trying to get home. His wagon crashed into a tree in the blinding snow. Even now, Oscar couldn't believe that Papa was gone. Papa was the toughest man Oscar knew. He'd been a sheriff in Dakota Territory. He'd survived a gunfight with one of the most brutal outlaws in the West. He'd carved a farm out of 40 acres of wild prairie. Papa was Oscar's hero. Those first weeks after Papa died, Oscar was sure his sadness would rip him apart, but he couldn't just lie in bed sobbing. With Papa gone, it was Oscar's job to help Mama with the farm. He made a whispered promise to Papa to watch over the farm, to work as hard as he could to keep it going. He worked before dawn and after school. He worked so hard that he'd fall into bed every night too exhausted to think. Mama wanted Oscar to see his friends. Maybe tomorrow, Oscar always answered. Then come sit with me a while, Mama would say. Let's play cards. He and Mama and Papa used to play fierce games of hearts. When Papa lost, he'd pretend to fly into a rage, pounding the table while Mama and Oscar doubled over laughing. But Oscar had no time for cards. All he wanted to do was work. The seasons passed in a blur of sweat and dirt and aching muscles. And Oscar would have just keep on going. But then, 6 months ago, Mr. Charlie Morrow appeared at their door. Mr. Morrow was an artist for a big Chicago newspaper. He'd come to Castle for his latest project, which was to paint scenes of life in a booming little prairie town. Mama was honored when Mr. Morrow stopped by and asked if he could paint their farm. Each morning for a month, Mr. Morrow would show up just after the sun rose, waving at Mama. And Oscar, with his paint-stained fingers, "Hello," he'd sing out. And he was a big man, with jet black hair and a beard to match. Mama said he reminded her of a giant from a fairy tale, but the nice kind, she explained. Oscar liked Morrow well enough he made Mama smile, that was for sure. Most nights after Morrow packed up his paints, he joined them for supper. Afterward, he and Mama would sit on the porch and look over the day's paintings. Oscar, join us, Mr. Morrow would boom. But why did Oscar need to look at paintings of his farm? He lived there. So he'd make excuses and then fall asleep to the sound of Mr. Morrow and Mama's soft laughter drifting upstairs. After Mr. Morrow went back to Chicago, Mama seemed to get a letter from him every single day. So maybe Oscar shouldn't have been shocked when 2 months ago Mama sat Oscar down under the apple tree with some big news. He asked me to marry him, she said. At first, Oscar laughed. Mr. Morrow? He was nothing like Papa. He was an artist. An artist! Was that even a job? But then Oscar noticed how Mama's eyes were twinkling. Oscar, she said, I want you to say yes. Oscar stopped laughing. He's a wonderful man, she said, and what a life we'll have with him in Chicago. At first, Oscar just sat there like he'd been smacked in the head with a shovel. Leave the farm? Move to Chicago? What about his promise to Papa? Oscar begged Mama he pleaded with her. He tried to make her understand that they needed to stay in Castle. Papa wouldn't want us to leave here, he exclaimed. But then Mama looked at Oscar with her hopeful eyes. Oscar, she said quietly, putting her hand up to Oscar's cheek. Her fingers were like Oscar's, covered with calluses and scars from all the scrubbing and weeding and washing that filled her days. All Papa ever wanted for us was to be happy. And Oscar could see that she had made up her mind. Oscar could have run away or refused to get on the train, but he didn't have the guts. So now here he was, miserable, chugging along with his stomach turning inside out. The train whistled, shrieked. Woo woo! Chicago, the conductor shouted. 10 minutes. Oscar's stomach flipped. Don't puke. His stomach didn't listen. He managed to slam open the window just in time to splatter his lunch across the tracks. Welcome to Chicago. And that's the end of chapter 1 and 2.